In the spring of 1921, deep beneath the Mellon estate in Pittsburgh, a crew of labourers struck something they had not been hired to find. They had been told they were digging the foundation for a new annex, a private wing meant to extend the great house westward toward the slope of the hill. What they uncovered instead was older than the house, older than the city, older than any record of Pittsburgh itself. They reached a layer of stone that did not match the bedrock around it. They reached a doorway that no map had ever shown. They reached a room that, according to every official history of that land, should not have existed at all. And by the end of that week in 1921, every single man on that crew had signed a document promising to never speak of what he saw beneath the earth. They were paid in full. They were paid in bonus. And most importantly, they were paid in silence. For more than 100 years, the secret held. The men aged. The men died. The estate was renovated, sold, redrawn, partially demolished, and rebuilt. The new wing was finished, but not where it had originally been planned. The foundation was shifted. The original pit was filled with concrete, sealed, forgotten. But one of those labourers, a quiet Irish-American steelworker named Cassian Brogden, did not destroy his account. He wrote it down on 3 folded sheets of paper, sealed it inside a small wooden chest, and left it for someone in his family to find long after he was gone. That chest sat in an attic in a farmhouse in western Pennsylvania for nearly 70 years, and when it was finally opened, the truth of what the Mellon estate had been built upon began at last to surface. Whatever was beneath that hill in 1921 did not belong to the 20th century, and the people who found it knew, the moment they saw it, that the history we have all been taught is not the history that actually happened. Before we go any deeper into this story, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. We document the buried, the erased, the structures and civilizations that the official record refuses to name. If you have ever stood inside an old American building and felt that something about the architecture did not match the date on the cornerstone, if you have ever looked at a star fort on a map and wondered who really built it, if you have ever felt that the timeline you were taught in school does not quite add up, then you are in the right place. Subscribe, settle in, and let us begin. The year is 1921. Andrew Mellon is one of the wealthiest men in the United States. He has just been appointed Secretary of the Treasury under President Warren Harding, a position he will hold for more than a decade under 3 different presidents. He controls banks, aluminum, coal, oil, and steel. His family name is woven into the foundation of Pittsburgh itself. The Mellon estate, situated on the eastern ridge of the city, is one of several properties the family maintains, and in that spring he commissions a small expansion. The plans call for a new annex, a quiet wing to be used for private offices and a library. The architect is a man named Mortimer Halpin. The contractor brings in a crew of about 14 labourers, mostly Irish, Polish and Slovak immigrants who have spent their lives moving earth for the industrial families of western Pennsylvania. The foreman is a heavy-set man named Owen Veitch, who has worked for the Mellons for nearly 20 years and is trusted with sensitive projects. The first 3 days of the dig go just as planned. The men remove topsoil, then subsoil, then begin breaking into the harder layers beneath. The estate sits on a ridge of sedimentary rock common to the Pittsburgh region. The men expect to chip their way down another 6 or 7 feet to reach the foundation depth. What they do not expect is what happens on the morning of the 4th day. Cassian Brogden, swinging a pick at the eastern edge of the pit, strikes a stone that does not break. It rings. Not the dull thud of sandstone, not the sharp crack of shale, but a clear, almost musical ring that travels up the handle of his tool and into his arm. He calls Veitch over. Veitch crouches down, brushes the dust away, and stares. The stone is not sandstone. It is a pale, almost cream-coloured block, perfectly squared, with edges so sharp and so clean that they could have been cut yesterday. The block is enormous, at least 4 feet across in the part that is visible, and it is fitted against another block of the same kind with a joint so tight that a knife blade cannot fit between them. There is no mortar, there is no gap. The two stones meet as though they had been poured together as one piece and then sliced apart. Vetch sends for the architect. Mortimer Halpin arrives within the hour. He looks at the stone for a moment. He kneels, he runs his fingers along it, he says nothing for a long time. Then he tells Vetch to send for Edmund Kerr, the Mellon family advisor who handles all matters that the family does not wish to discuss in writing. Kerr arrives that afternoon in a black motor car. He is a thin grey man in his late 50s with the kind of stillness that comes from a lifetime of keeping other people's secrets. He looks at the stones, he looks at Halpin, he looks at the crew, and then he gives an order that none of the men have ever heard before on a construction site. He tells them to keep digging, but to dig outward, not downward. He tells them to expose the full surface of whatever lies beneath. He tells them that they will be paid double for every day they work on this exposure, and triple if they finish in less than a week. And he tells them that nothing they see is to be discussed with anyone outside the pit. The crew digs. Over the next 4 days, they uncover an area of fitted stone roughly 30 feet across. It is not a floor. It is not a wall. It is a curved surface sloping gently downward toward the centre, like the upper face of a great dome that has been buried so deep that only its crown is showing. The stones are all the same pale colour, all the same impossible fit. There is no weathering. There is no moss, no root damage, no soot from the centuries of coal smoke that have darkened every other surface in Pittsburgh. The dome looks as though it was placed in the earth yesterday, even though it sits beneath layers of soil and rock that geologists would say took thousands of years to accumulate. On the 8th day, Brogden's pick finds a seam. It is not a crack. It is a deliberate joint, a thin line that runs in a circle about 8 feet across, set into the top of the dome. The men brush it clean. It is a hatch, a round door, perfectly flush with the surface, with no hinge, no handle, no visible mechanism of any kind. Kerr is summoned again. He stands at the edge of the pit and stares down at the hatch for nearly an hour without speaking. Then he tells the men to clear the area and to wait. That night, Andrew Mellon himself comes to the estate. He is 66 years old, gaunt, quiet, dressed in a long dark coat. He descends into the pit with a single oil lamp and stands on the dome alone for almost 20 minutes. The men watch from the upper edge. None of them speak. When Mellon climbs back out, he says only 4 words to Kerr. He says, "Open it carefully." Then he gets into his motor car and is driven back into the city. The hatch is open the following morning. It does not require force. Halpin, working with a thin steel pry bar, finds that the seam responds to gentle pressure at a single point on its eastern edge. When he presses there, the entire disc of stone lifts upward by about an inch and then pivots silently on a hidden pivot, swinging downward into the dome and revealing a circular opening. The opening releases a breath of cool air. It does not smell stale. It smells faintly of something the men cannot identify, something metallic and clean, almost like the air after a thunderstorm. Below the opening, a spiral staircase descends into darkness. The steps are made of the same pale stone as the dome, uniform polished, curving downward in a tight helix around a central column that vanishes into the dark. Cassian Brogden is the first man down the stairs. He carries an oil lamp and a length of rope tied around his waist, the other end held by Veitch at the surface. He counts the steps as he descends. He counts 40. He counts 80. He counts 112 before the staircase opens into a vaulted hall. The hall is long, perhaps 60 feet from end to end, with a ceiling that arches overhead in a series of ribbed vaults. The ribs are coated, or perhaps lined, with a metal that gleams faintly in the lamplight. It has a soft reddish sheen in places and a deep green patina in others, and Brogden, who has worked in copper mills, recognizes it immediately. The entire ceiling is sheathed in copper, oxidized in patches, but still largely intact, hammered into shapes that follow the curves of the vaults with a precision no roofer he has ever known could match. The walls of the hall are smooth, almost polished, and they carry inscriptions. Not English, not Latin, not Greek, not any script Brogden has ever seen. The characters are angular and intricate, arranged in long horizontal bands at chest height, running the full length of both walls. Some resemble crosses, some resemble stars, some resemble spirals, and many resemble letters from no alphabet he can name. The inscriptions are cut into the stone with absolute precision, as though etched by a machine that did not know how to make a crooked line. At the far end of the hall there is a doorway. It is taller than the hall itself, taller than any door should be, and it is framed by two pillars that are not stone but metal, the same coppery alloy as the ceiling, fluted and chased with patterns that catch the lamplight in unfamiliar ways. Through the doorway Brogden steps into a circular chamber. The chamber is the heart of the structure. It is roughly 30 feet across, perfectly circular, with a domed ceiling that mirrors the curve of the buried dome above. The floor is inlaid with an 8-pointed star, each point reaching almost to the wall, the star itself made of a darker stone set into the pale stone of the floor. Around the perimeter of the chamber, set at intervals into the wall, are 8 niches, each containing a column of the same coppery metal, each column carved with the same unknown script. In the exact center of the star, rising from the floor, is the machine. That is the only word Brogden uses for it in his letter. He calls it the machine. It stands about 6 feet tall, mounted on a circular base of polished stone. It consists of 3 concentric rings of metal, the outer ring stationary, the middle and inner rings appearing capable of rotation, though they do not move while he watches. Through the center of all 3 rings rises a single vertical spike, tapering to a point, made of the same alloy as the rings. At the base of the spike, wound around the lowest portion, are coils of fine wire, dozens of them layered so tightly that they appear almost solid. The wire is not corroded, the metal is not tarnished. The machine looks as though it was built that morning. Brogden walks slowly around it. He does not touch it. He examines every angle. He notes the inscriptions on the rings, the patterns on the base, the way the spike at the top is so perfectly vertical that it seems to align with something far above, perhaps with the crown of the dome itself. He stands there for a long time, and then, against every instinct he has, he reaches out and places his palm flat against the outer ring. In his letter he describes what happens next very carefully. He felt a tingling first in the tips of his fingers, then in his palm, then up his arm into his shoulder. The air around the machine grew warmer, not hotter, just warmer, by perhaps 10 degrees. He heard a sound, very faint, the kind of sound a tuning fork makes long after it has been struck, a tone so quiet that it might have been inside his own skull. The lamplight in the chamber dimmed for a moment, as though something had drawn the brightness out of the flame, and then returned. When he pulled his hand away, the tingling stopped immediately, the warmth faded, the sound vanished, and the lamp burned as it had before. The whole sensation lasted no more than 15 seconds. But in those 15 seconds, Cassian Brogden understood that he was standing in front of a working device, not a relic, not a sculpture, not a tomb offering, a machine that, after centuries or millennia in the dark, still recognized the touch of a human hand and still responded to it. He climbed the stairs. He told Veitch told Halpin told Kerr told Mellon, and within 24 hours the entire operation changed. A new crew arrived, smaller, quieter, men who did not speak to the original labourers and who carried equipment that the original labourers did not recognize. The original crew was kept at the surface and put to work on unrelated tasks. They were forbidden from approaching the pit. The pit was covered with a heavy tarp. Lanterns burned over it through the night. The new crew worked inside the dome for 6 days. The original men never saw what was removed, if anything was removed at all. They saw only that on the 7th day the tarp came off, the pit was filled with poured concrete, layer after layer, until the dome and the staircase and the hall and the chamber and the machine were all buried beneath a solid plug of new construction. The annex foundation, originally planned to sit directly above the dome, was shifted 40 feet to the north. The new wing was built, the lawns were restored. Within a year, no visitor to the Mellon estate would have any reason to suspect that anything unusual had ever happened on that ridge. The labourers were called into Kerr's office one by one. Each man was presented with a document. It stated that the signer agreed, in exchange for a substantial cash payment, to never speak of, write of, or in any way disclose any aspect of the work performed at the estate that spring. The cash payment for each man was the equivalent of 3 years of wages, paid in full in unmarked bills in a sealed envelope. The men signed, they took the envelopes, they went home. Most of them never spoke of it again. A few died within 5 years of the dig. Veitch himself died in 1924 of what was officially recorded as a heart attack. Halpin returned to New York and never took another commission from the Mellon family. Andrew Mellon went on to shape American economic policy through the Roaring Twenties, the crash, and the early years of the Depression. Cassian Brogden was different. He took the money. He kept his mouth shut for the rest of his life. But he sat down sometime in the late 1940s, and he wrote it all out. The ring of the pick on the stone, the fit of the joints, the hatch, the stairs, the hall, the copper, the script, the chamber, the star, the machine, the tingling in his hand, the dimming of the lamp. He folded the pages, sealed them in a chest, and left it to his daughter with instructions that it not be opened until after she, too, was gone. The chest passed to her daughter, Tabitha Renshaw, who finally opened it in the late 1990s. She read the letter. She kept it for years. And only recently did the contents of those 3 folded pages begin to circulate among the researchers who study what is sometimes called the buried history of North America. What was Cassian Brogden standing in front of in the spring of 1921? The answer, if there is one, lies in a body of evidence that the official record has spent more than 100 years dismissing and burying under fresh layers of concrete of its own. It lies in the star forts, it lies in the mounds, it lies in the impossible cathedrals of the late 19th century, built in years rather than decades, by populations that the official record claims did not have the workforce or the technology to build them. And it lies in the persistent rumour of a civilization that occupied this continent before the one we are told about. A civilization whose name appears on old maps and in old documents, written in a dozen languages and a dozen scripts, always the same word or a variation of it: Tartaria. The Mellon estate sat on the eastern ridge of Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh sits at the confluence of 3 rivers, the Allegheny, the Monongahela, and the Ohio. That confluence has been recognized as a place of strategic and spiritual importance for as long as any human record extends. The Adana and Hopewell cultures built mounds along these rivers more than 2,000 years ago. But long before any of these, according to a handful of old maps, the confluence of those rivers was marked with a symbol that appears nowhere in the official history of the region. The symbol is a star, an 8-pointed star, the same star that Cassian Brogden saw inlaid into the floor of the chamber beneath the Mellon estate. Star forts are scattered across the eastern half of the United States, across Europe, across Asia, across South America, across every continent that humans have walked upon. The official explanation is that they were built during the era of gunpowder warfare as defensive fortifications designed to deflect cannon fire with their angled walls. This explanation falls apart the moment you ask why so many star forts exist in places where there was never any war, why they appear on maps drawn before the regions around them were officially settled, why they share an identical geometry across continents that supposedly had no contact with each other, and why so many of them sit on top of, or beside, or directly above sites of older and unexplained construction. The chamber beneath the Mellon estate, with its 8-pointed star, its copper sheathing, its inscribed walls, and its central machine, fits the profile of what some researchers now describe as a node. The theory, in its simplest form, is that the civilization remembered as Tartaria built a network of structures across the surface of the Earth that collected, processed, and distributed a form of atmospheric energy that we no longer use and no longer understand. And the star forts were not forts. The cathedrals were not merely places of worship. The World's Fairs of the late 19th century were not built from scratch in a few months. They were repurposed. They were claimed by a civilization that came afterward and pretended to have built them. And beneath some of them, sometimes by accident, the original mechanisms still exist. If the chamber beneath the Mellon estate was a node, then the machine in the centre of the star was its core. The vertical spike, the concentric rings, the coiled wire, the copper ceiling above acting as a collector, the buried dome acting as a resonator. The geometry is consistent with what the inventor Nikola Tesla was attempting to reconstruct at Wardenclyffe on Long Island only 20 years earlier. Tesla never finished Wardenclyffe. His funding was cut, his tower was demolished, his papers were seized after his death in 1943 by the United States government. He spoke openly of his belief that the ancients had possessed a form of wireless energy transmission, that he was not inventing it from scratch, but rediscovering it. He was personally acquainted with several members of the Mellon family. The timing of his work, the timing of his correspondence with the Mellons, and the timing of the discovery beneath the estate all fall within the same narrow window. The civilization that built such machines, if it existed, did not vanish in a single moment. It was buried, slowly, deliberately, and in some cases catastrophically. The phenomenon sometimes called the mud flood refers to a period, broadly placed in the early 19th century, during which the lower floors of countless buildings across Europe, Asia, and North America were buried beneath several feet of soil and silt, leaving the upper floors at what is now considered ground level. Visitors to old districts in St. Petersburg, in London, in Boston, and in Pittsburgh frequently notice that the windows of supposed basements sit at ground level, that doorways open into walls of earth, that staircases descend from sidewalks into shops that were once entered at street level and now lie below it. The official explanation is urban regrading. This explanation accounts for some cases. It does not account for all of them. If the lower levels of Pittsburgh were once at street level, then the original ridge of what is now the Mellon estate would have been considerably higher above the river than the current map suggests. The dome that Brogden's crew uncovered would not have been buried at all when it was first built. It would have been the crown of a visible structure, standing on a hill above the confluence of three rivers, perhaps part of a larger complex that has since been broken apart, scattered and concealed beneath the modern city. The chamber, the staircase, the hall, and the machine would have been accessible, used, operational. Pittsburgh is built on top of older Pittsburgh. The Mellon estate was built on top of an older estate. The older estate, by the evidence of Brogden's letter, was built on top of a structure that predates every record of the region. And that structure, if Brogden is to be believed, was not abandoned by accident. It was buried. It was hidden. It was forgotten on purpose. And when Andrew Mellon stood at the edge of that pit in 1921, in his long dark coat with his single oil lamp, looking down at the crown of a dome that should not have been there, he was looking at the truth of his own city and his own continent. He chose to bury it again. He paid the men, he sealed the dome, he shifted the annex, he went back to Washington. He died in 1937, and he left behind, beneath a quiet ridge in eastern Pittsburgh, a chamber with an 8-pointed star and a machine that still hummed when a workman's hand touched it. The Mellon estate, in its original form, no longer stands. Portions of the property have been redeveloped over the past century. The exact location of the 1921 excavation is no longer public knowledge, and the records of the construction project from that spring have not survived in any archive that the public can access. The Mellon family papers contain no reference to the dig. The architect, Mortimer Halpin's records, donated by his estate after his death in 1956, contain a curious gap. The years 1920 through 1922 are missing entirely. The letter of Cassian Brogden, in the keeping of his granddaughter Tabitha Renshaw, has not been published in full. Excerpts have circulated. The descriptions of the dome, the hall, the chamber, and the machine match in their specifics similar accounts recorded by other workmen at other estates owned by other industrial families in the same era. The Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Fricks. There is a pattern stretching from the late 19th century into the middle of the 20th of major American industrial families commissioning construction projects that uncovered and then quietly reburied structures that did not match any known period of American history. These families had every reason to want the official history of the continent they controlled to remain exactly as it was, And so they paid the labourers, they drafted the documents, they poured the concrete, they moved the foundations, they built their annexes a little to the north, or a little to the south, or a little to the west. And they went home, and they continued the work of running the country whose true past they had just buried again. What we walk on every day in every old city in this country is not what we think it is. The streets are not the original streets. The buildings are not always the buildings their cornerstones claim. The foundations beneath the foundations are often older than anything written in the deeds. And somewhere beneath the eastern ridge of Pittsburgh, beneath a layer of poured concrete from the spring of 1921, beneath the corrected lawns and the shifted annex and the quiet century that has passed since, there is a dome, there is a hatch, there is a spiral staircase descending into a vaulted hall sheathed in copper. There is an inscribed wall in a language no one alive can read. There is a circular chamber with an 8-pointed star inlaid into its floor, and in the exact centre of that star there is a machine. It is still there. It has not moved. It has not corroded. It has not forgotten how to respond to the touch of a human hand. It is waiting beneath a city that has built 100 years of new history on top of it, beneath a country that has spent that century insisting that its past is exactly what the textbooks say it is. Cassian Brogden lived to be 83 years old. He worked in the mills until his back gave out. He never once spoke aloud of what he had seen beneath the Mellon estate. He left the chest to his daughter with instructions that it not be opened until she, too, was gone. Her daughter, Tabitha Renshaw, opened it in 1998. She read the 3 folded pages. She understood for the first time why her grandfather had never quite seemed to belong to the same world as everyone else around him. He had seen the older world, he had stood inside it, he had touched it, and he had spent the remaining 40 years of his life pretending that he had not. The pages are real. The chest is real. The estate was real. The dig was real. The dome, the hatch, the staircase, the hall, the copper, the script, the chamber, the star, and the machine, according to the only direct witness who left a record, were all real, and all still beneath that hill on the eastern ridge of Pittsburgh, where they have been, in silence since long before the city was named. If you have walked the streets of an old American city and felt that the buildings were older than their official dates, you were not imagining it. If you have stood on a hill above a confluence of rivers and felt that something was beneath you that should not have been, you were not imagining it either. The continent is older than the textbooks. The cities are older than the cornerstones. The families that built the modern order knew this, and they buried the evidence again and again, in concrete, in silence, in documents signed by men who were paid never to speak. But one of those men wrote it down anyway. And in the wooden chest of an Irish-American steelworker, in 3 folded pages, in a careful, patient hand, the truth of what lies beneath the Mellon estate has survived. It has crossed a century. It has reached us, and it is, at last, beginning to be heard.